Hey, are we recording? Yes, good. Okay, this month we welcome our speaker, archaeologist Amy Goldstein of cultural resource management firm Johnson, Murmuran and Thompson in Austin. Amy holds an undergraduate degree in history and anthropology from Middle Tennessee State University and a master's degree in anthropology from the University of South Carolina. Since 2015, she has worked at several CRM firms in Texas and has been with JMT for 3 years, serving as the section head for natural and cultural resources for Texas and neighboring states. Amy will be speaking about her experiences as the primary investigator at the Kirbee Kiln site in Montgomery County from 2022 to 2024. Kirbee Kiln was one of the earliest commercial kilns to operate in Texas, at a site just west of the town of Montgomery, producing alkaline glazed products in traditional techniques brought from Edgefield, South Carolina. The large groundhog kiln and Kirbee family business operated from about 1849 to 1860. The kiln was rediscovered and initially excavated in the early 1970s and was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1973. As many of you know, HAS members have worked at this site for several 10-day periods each year during 2022 to 2024, and we thoroughly enjoyed working with Amy and her team. So, without further ado, Amy, over to you.
Okay, now's the part where I start talking.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I know this is something Frank and I have been trying to kind of make happen for a couple of years now. So I think it's actually good timing that, we've kind of hit sort of a stopping point in our work, and now it's a good time to sort of reflect and go over what we've done. So I've presented on this topic for the last two TAS meetings. So my plan for this talk is I'm going to kind of meld those two together and sort of give you an unabridged explanation of the Kirbee Kiln site and talk about the work that we've recently done there. So first, I'll kind of give like a historical context for the site and explain how we came to be working on this site in the first place. Then I'll talk about the results of the fieldwork and the artifact analysis that we've done over the last few years. And then I'll talk about some of our conclusions and, as we've been mentioning, the potential for future work. So the Kirbee Kiln site, it's one of the largest and earliest stoneware kilns in Texas. And the kiln produced alkaline glazed utilitarian wares on an industrial scale, industrial for the mid-19th century. It's located north of Houston in Montgomery County, where the Red Star is there. And the site includes the kiln itself, as well as the production and living areas associated with the kiln. So we know from archival records that the kiln operated from about 1847 to 1860. And it was built and operated by James Kirbee and three of his sons, and probably almost certainly enslaved African Americans too. And James Kirbee was born around 1791 in South Carolina, and he spent most of the first 30 years of his life living in Edgefield, South Carolina, which was well known for its pioneering work in alkaline glazed stoneware in the mid-19th century. And historical records for James Kirbee are sparse, but we assume that he learned the pottery trade during his time living in Edgefield. So, like many of the Potter family clans in the Southeast, the Kirbee family slowly moved west. So James Kirbee was born, like I said, about 1791 in Darlington, South Carolina. And that's that upper rightmost star in South Carolina. And we know that by 1800, he was living with his parents and younger siblings in the Edgefield district of South Carolina down here. In the 1820 census, he was still there living with his wife, half brother, three sons, and a daughter. And we first know that he moved over to Georgia in 1824 Or at least that's the first time we see it in the historical records, where he's listed as a grantor for 116 acres in Elbert County, Georgia. And marriage and deed records also show that James and his children and his younger half brother lived in Georgia for about 20 years. We know that by 1845, several of his sons and his half brother Willis were living over here in Russell County, Alabama. And then between 1846 and 1847, James and three of his sons moved to Montgomery, Texas. So nearly all of the southeastern potters who moved to Texas before the Civil War settled in Russ County, but the Kirbees came to Montgomery County. Now, most people went to Russ County because it was known that there were large deposits of kaolin clay, which is the specific kind of clay that you need to make stoneware pottery. It's a lot more rare than the kind of clays that you use to make earthenware. So these kilns and the sort of pottery clan families that made them tend to follow these deposits of clay. So why come to Montgomery County if it doesn't have these huge sources of kaolin clay? The best explanation that we can come up with, and when I say we, this is Meredith Dreiss and David Brown. This has kind of been, the historical research has sort of been really their thing. And the best idea that we can come up with is probably because Zachariah and William Landrum lived nearby, and the Landrum family were kind of sort of the biggest family in Edgefield, South Carolina, sort of the pioneers of this alkaline glaze stoneware pottery. So even though Zachariah and William, when they moved to Montgomery, are cattle ranchers, they probably had knowledge of the family business and probably saw the kaolin clay around. And we're assuming there must have been some kind of connection between these two, because it doesn't make sense that they would just kind of wander around looking for this relatively rare clay deposit. They must have been tipped off by someone. So that's what we're thinking. But around 1847, they built their kiln, and they built it on land that was owned by Peter Willis. So they didn't build this on land that they owned. We don't have any kind of leasing agreements or any kind of historical records about it, but we're assuming that because the Willises owned so much land in this, they also had this mercantile store in the town of Montgomery, that there may have been some kind of arrangement where the Kirbees like built their kiln and used the resources available on the land in exchange for like a portion of their finished wares. That's speculative, but just trying to come up with an understanding of why they built this kiln on someone else's property and how that came to be. So a little bit about the previous archaeology at Kirbee Kiln. So the first archaeological investigations of the kiln occurred in the early 1970s after George Mitchell, the landowner, contacted the Texas Historical Commission. He learned about the kiln's existence on his property from Georgiana Greer, who was a stoneware expert, and also a local historian named Bessie Owens. So after he contacted the THC, after a little time went by, James Malone, who was an archaeologist at the THC at the time, he came out to the site with a small group of professional archaeologists, and they conducted some testing excavations on the kiln. That led to the kiln being listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1973. So the 1970s excavations were really focused on the kiln itself and the area immediately surrounding it. So we'll come back to this timeline slide. But real quick, Malone classified this as a groundhog type kiln, but he did note that it is unusually long. The kiln was about 18 meters long, so very large kiln. The excavations that the THC did, they showed that the kiln, they were focused on sort of figuring out how the kiln was constructed and used. And as a result of that, there are, I think, over 30,000 sherds from their excavations that are now at the Center for Archaeological Research in San Antonio. But out of all of the artifacts, the tens of thousands that they collected over these 3 years of testing, the only artifacts that they found that weren't directly related to the stoneware manufacturing were 3 square cut nails and 2 pieces of hand painted pearlware. So obviously the area that they were focused on was very much just about the kiln and the actual production of the stoneware. So the site boundary that is recorded for this site that is currently on the atlas and was used for the National Register nomination, it's only 1.7 acres, but Malone and colleagues in the report that they produced, they said that they believed that the site was bigger and that it probably included other areas for production of the stoneware, but also probably living areas, at least temporary living areas for those who are working this kiln. So after the Malone excavations, no work took place on the site for 40 years. Then in 2020, the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation acquired the Mayer Tract. It's an 877 acre parcel of land that includes Kirbee Kiln. And so George Mitchell did own this property. He sold it at some point in, I think, the 1980s or 1990s. George Mitchell is no longer living, but the foundation that's named after him and his wife, they repurchased this property. So the reason they purchased it was with the goal of establishing some conservation easements around particularly the water, but also the cultural resources that they knew were on the property. This tract is adjacent to the north to a 5,000 plus acre conservancy. And there was some concern that, you know, if it's sold to developers, how will they develop that property and how will it affect their water resources downstream? So the goal is to buy the property, put some conservation easements on it, and then resell the property to a developer who's going to agree to develop it in a more environmentally conscious manner. So in order to establish this archaeological conservation easement, Meredith Dreiss, who is the daughter of George Mitchell, and David Brown, her husband, they started this sort of collaborative multidisciplinary project to first try to identify sites on the property and then establish a true boundary for the Kirbee Kiln site, 41 MQ38, and then assess the significance of the portion of the site that hasn't been recorded so far. So back to our timeline. To this end, the foundation hired Rain Clark to conduct an archaeological survey of the tract in 2021. And that survey, in addition to identifying some other sites, it identified potential occupation areas that were contemporary with the kiln. So after that, Archaeogeophysical Associates, so Chet Walker and Andrea Thompson, they were hired to conduct magnetometer and GPR surveys on the terrace to the west of the kiln. So this is showing the area of the initial magnetometer survey on the left. And that showed a cluster of anomalies in the same area where some positive shovel tests had found the mid-19th century artifacts. It's within a little red box. I know it kind of just looks like a bunch of black dots. But then they used that information to do GPR on a smaller area. And then the GPR data also showed a large cluster of anomalies in that same location. So that's, in this case, it's the red and yellow areas. From March 3rd through 6th, 2022, volunteers from HAS and volunteer professional archaeologists, including myself and Kristen Embry, we opened 11 1x1 meter test units within the areas that were corresponding to the GPR anomalies. And you can kind of see where we did these. We ended up creating sort of 3 separate blocks, not intentionally, that's just sort of how it worked out. And the test units uncovered essentially three important features. So feature one is this handmade brick alignment that you see on the left. Feature two is a metal pipe fragment. That's what that is. I know it kind of looks like a bone in the picture, but it's part of a metal pipe. And there's this stain surrounding it. And then feature three, we were interpreting as a possible wall fall. So in addition to excavating the test units, we excavated 28 shovel tests. I know nobody likes shovel tests, but they're important. We excavated the shovel tests to the south and the west of the units to try to determine the site boundaries. There were 17 positive shovel tests from that, but there was no definitive site boundary. Almost everyone was positive for Kirbee age artifacts. So the artifacts that we collected from 2022 are actually kind of just now being analyzed. But what we knew at the time for sure was that at the end of the field season was that this portion of the site was definitely contemporaneous with the kiln. And it suggested that it was probably an area of domestic use and potentially also some industrial activities. So a quick aside about this feature two pipe soil. My husband, who's a geoarchaeologist and has also been out at the site several times, he collected some soil samples from the stain right around it. And some of the initial elemental testing that he did on it shows signatures similar to other kiln manufacturing areas. And it's really preliminary. He hasn't published any of this information or really even talked about it anywhere, but I think it's interesting to note that it does suggest that there was, in addition to, living in the area, they were doing also some kind of work with the kiln in this area. So we knew we wanted to do more work out there. In December of 2022, Archaeogeophysical Associates returned to the site to conduct more extensive GPR survey. As you can see, a very extensive GPR survey of the terrace that's northwest of the kiln. The idea was to better understand the depth of the features that were identified in the magnetometer survey, and then also to help guide the placement of additional units. So in January of 2023, JMT, the company that I work for, was hired to oversee additional excavations and then analyze the resulting assemblage. The 2022 field season was entirely volunteer based, and while that is nice, sometimes it can be difficult to not have any one person kind of running the show. So I think David and Meredith realized that they wanted someone to help organize things and sort of oversee the fieldwork and analysis. So that's sort of where we came in. And so excavations in 2023 were from April 12th through 21st. And most of the crew was made up of you lovely folks from the HAS. And again, we also had just other volunteers outside of HAS, some other volunteer professional archaeologists, etc. And the excavations that year focused on expanding blocks A and B to better understand the features that we had uncovered in the previous year. And then we also wanted to open a new block that's across one of these sort of long and shallow pits that are visible sort of across that whole field out there, just to try to figure out what they are and if they're associated with the kiln. So by the end of the 2023 field season, we had uncovered much more of feature one. It had, if you remember, at the end of 2022, we just had this small little section up here. Everyone is, of course, wondering what it is. It was found on the last day. So we opened up a lot more, got to see a lot more of it. And it showed that it's a little strange. It is definitely some kind of handmade brick feature, probably a foundation for something. But the corner wasn't really square. it's a little more than 90 degrees, which is odd. Um, when we were looking around feature two, we didn't find any more pieces of metal pipe, but we did find these two sort of pit-like features with some dark staining soil and bricks surrounding it. It seems like they're kind of infilled in a way. They're not level like they are in the wall of feature one that you see. And excavations across the large pit, which is what's shown here in this bottom picture, they showed that the pit was likely hand dug. All the artifacts found within it were from the mid 19th century, so Kirbee occupation. We know that what was in the pit was burned at least once, a lot of burned material. We found we think it is cypress, like a wood plank that was fairly large, like a few feet long. We think that it may be related to land clearing in the late 19th century, but we're not really sure. Don't think it was associated with like the kiln production of pottery, but still had some artifacts from that time period. So over the summer of 2023, Kristen Embry analyzed the artifacts from the 2023 field season. And the analysis showed that the assemblage was dominated by structural items, so brick and cut nails essentially. And the second most common artifact type was ceramic sherds, which is maybe not what you would expect from a ceramic kiln. We had 231 sherds recovered. 77.4% of those were alkaline glaze stoneware sherds. So the vessels that they were producing at the site. And then refined white earthenware accounted for 21.5% of the ceramic assemblage. We had 1% other, which was, I believe, a piece of yellowware and then a piece of indigenous ceramic. So most of the stoneware specimens had some sort of defect, with immature glazes being the most common. And that wasn't unexpected based on the assemblage that we had looked at from the Malone excavations. Most of the stoneware vessels represent probably either wasters that were damaged during firing or what we call seconds, which are less than perfect vessels that were still usable and may have been used by the people living and working at the site, but wouldn't have been sold. We had several pieces of diagnostic refined white earthenware that confirms that this part of the site is contemporary with the 1847 to 1860 kiln operation. Talk more about that in a minute. So the presence of the refined white earthenware tablewares, as well as some other non-industrial or structural artifacts, like this medicine bottle here, which was a Lynn Smith and Company wholesale druggist bottle that came from Philadelphia. We have gun flints, several gun flints. These are silverware fragments down here, a button. These all suggest that this was an area of the site where people probably lived, at least on a temporary basis while they were working on the kiln. And just to remind you, this is in stark contrast to the tens of thousands of sherds from the Malone excavations with just 5 non-alkaline glazed sherd artifacts. So in just one season, we found quite a bit more than that. So we knew that we were going to come back in 2024, and we had some specific goals based on what we found in 2023 in the resulting analysis. So first, we're hoping to determine the southern and eastern site boundaries because, again, one of our larger goals of the project is to define these conservation easements and then also hopefully update the National Register listing for the site. Then, of course, assess the integrity and significance of those portions of the site. And then we still just weren't sure what feature one was. So I'm just trying to understand that a little bit more. So we knew that shovel testing across these entire landforms at like 10-meter intervals is not going to be a feasible way of finding the site boundaries given the time and resource constraints that we had on the project. So to accomplish our first goal of looking for the site boundaries, we really relied on the magnetometer and the GPR data that we gathered to guide the placement of some test units. And especially in the south area of the field, that was really critical because that was sort of the biggest landform area and the biggest area that the site could have expanded to. And then we also use that information to expand to the east side of Juggery Creek from where we had been working. So in the South Field area, we opened 5 new test units where both magnetometer and GPR had showed anomalies. And despite some promising geophysical data, the grand total of historical artifacts that we found from these test units was 9 wire nails. Womp womp. So after finishing those 5 units, we also excavated a few more shovel tests on what we thought were like lower probability geophysical anomalies. And all of those were also negative for historical artifacts. So the South Field wasn't particularly exciting for those who were digging there that year. But what is exciting is that we're pretty confident about the southern site boundary for at least the Kirbee occupation of the site. And I guess I should stop here to say that there are prehistoric artifacts all over. Everywhere that we have dug out here, pretty much, we have also found prehistoric artifacts. So this site boundary that I show here is really just related to the Kirbee occupation. So the next thing that we were planning to do was open up units on the east side of the creek. So over to this side. Can you guys see my mouse when I have it on there?
Not right now.
I feel like I'm pointing at things with my mouse and I'm like hoping that you can see it, but you can. But okay, so we also moved to the east side of the creek. And we opened 6 new test units on the east side. Really just looking to see if the site extended over there, and if it did, is it an intact and significant portion of the site? So once again, over here, we had magnetometer data, and that guided the placement of our first 4 units. We noticed a series of anomalies that seemed to form a circle with a large dipole anomaly in the center. And we were hopeful that this could be the remains of the pug mill, which is where the clay would have been turned with a large paddle pulled by horses or mules. So that was kind of the optimistic hypothesis for what this could be. We were able to pretty quickly determine what the large dipole anomaly was at the center, and it was caused by this large piece of ferrous metal. And it looks like a pipe, but it is in fact solid metal. It's probably some kind of wheel axle or other machine axle. Other artifacts from that unit were primarily stoneware sherds, although there was some pearlware and whiteware present too. Notably, there were also several thick flakes that were found with the historic artifacts. And I bring that up because while we had been finding prehistoric stuff beneath the historic occupation, in this case, they appeared mixed. So we'd hope that the pair of units that we placed over the outside edge of our circular anomaly would give us the feature that we were looking for, but instead we found half a horseshoe and a burned tree stump. These units also had a variety of mid-19th century ceramics, some small brick fragments, nails, and again, lithic flakes throughout all of the levels. So as we were getting near the end of our field season and getting increasingly desperate, we decided to switch tactics, and we put a couple more units where a large GPR anomaly had showed up that was even further to the east. Unfortunately, after around levels 4 to 5 of these units, it was clear that the GPR anomaly that we were looking at was a large push pile that had been burned during land clearing. There were more mid-19th century artifacts found within the units, but they were, again, intermixed with lithic flakes. And then in level 3 of one of the units, we found a plastic lid for like a fast food drink cup. That definitely confirmed that the area had been significantly disturbed sometime in the last like 30 to 40 years. So a little disappointing there. We also excavated 3 shovel tests to the east of the Block E units. It's those 3 red dots that you're seeing on the far right side of the map. And so at this point, we have a general sense of where the eastern site boundary is for the Kirbee occupation. Ideally, we'd like to add some more shovel tests in there to the north and south of that to just confirm that we have at least a rough idea of where that eastern site boundary is. And we know that, yes, the Kirbee occupation did extend to the east side of Juggery Creek. Unfortunately, it's suffered from a lot of ground disturbance. It's not intact, and it really doesn't have enough integrity to be a contributing element to the site's NRHP eligibility. So then that brings us to our final goal of the 2024 field season, which was to open up even more of feature 1 to try to understand what the heck it might have been. So to do that, we opened up these 2 more units within Block A to see if we could find the southwestern corner of it and see if it made any more sense than the northwestern corner did. And we found that the southwestern corner is also slightly greater than 90 degrees, but not quite as much as the northwestern corner. So once these units were down to the level where the feature was exposed, there weren't really any artifacts except like the bricks themselves and then some cut nail fragments. I think there were a few pieces of olive glass, but mostly we're just looking at structural items. So this is a sort of digital drawing of Block A that Kristen did that really, I think, shows it well, that when you first look at it, you're like, oh, that's a rectangular house foundation or something, but it's not. It's kind of weird. So we have this more complete picture of feature 1, but it's still a mystery as to what it might have been. So one hypothesis that has been thrown out is that it could have been a mud cap chimney, because I guess those did not always have the like squared angles. But we don't really see evidence of burning within it. So I don't know that it makes sense as a chimney, but I'm open to suggestions if anybody has any. So after the 2024 artifact analysis, Kristen also worked on that. And we had 497 artifacts from that year. We combined them with the 2023 assemblage to give us 1,098 in total. So prior to combining the assemblage into one, adding the 2024 data, structural items had been the most dominant artifact class, but that changed to ceramics following the addition of the 2024 artifacts. And of the ceramics recovered, the locally produced alkaline glazed stoneware now accounts for an even greater proportion of the assemblage, so increasing from 77 to 89%. And this is largely because the Block E units that were east of the creek have produced the greatest number of stoneware sherds at the site, 367 just in the one field season. And I can attest that it's not because there's a bunch of tiny little sherds. There are a lot of bigger sherds from that area. So after looking at the assemblage altogether, Kristen was able to show that there are a minimum number of 21 different stoneware vessels represented in our assemblage to date. And the forms represented are bowls, jars, jugs, and then stoneware tableware forms, so like plates and cups and things like that. So out of these, the tableware is particularly interesting because it wasn't commonly produced. The stoneware kilns were usually producing like the bigger utilitarian things like big jugs used for like storing alcohol or butter churns or things like that. And we think it shows that the Kirbees were trying to fill a need in the market for tablewares at a time and place when, you know, most of the commonly imported tablewares weren't readily available. This was essentially the frontier at the time that they were there. The examples of the stoneware tableware that we have are all from Blocky on the east side of the creek. And they include 5 fragments of flatwares, a bowl fragment, a cup or a mug rim, and then 2 footed bases. They're all thin bodied and all but one have mature glazes. So these are things that they probably would have and did sell. Okay, so we also continue to find smaller quantities of these imported refined industrial earthenware. So found another piece of this fort pattern cup that we had found the year before, and some more splatterware that we found in Block E. So what are some of the things that we can say in conclusion for the site so far? We can definitely say that the site is much larger than its originally recorded 1.7 acre boundary, and it does include a domestic area. We know that from the different types of artifacts that we found in that area, and we know that they're contemporaneous with the kiln. We know that the southern site boundary for the Kirbee occupation is established, and we can pretty well say that the eastern boundary is established too, but that section does not retain any integrity. Unfortunately, we still don't really know what feature 1 is. So that sort of brings me to this idea of goals and future work. I know that we all kind of hope to go out there again. We had planned to do some work in the spring of 2025 initially, but sort of life got in the way. David injured himself, broke both of his arms and his collarbone. And we also just realized that we need to do a little bit more analysis, and that includes analyzing the 2022 assemblage, adding it into our overall analysis to get a bigger picture of what's going on. So we're unclear about if and when we might go back, but some goals for if we do, we still need to look at the northern or western site boundaries, again, with the idea of establishing these conservation easements and then updating the site's NRHP listing. Returning to the main area, I don't know there's a lot more that we can do with feature 1 that would be really fruitful, but there is one more large GPR anomaly that we haven't looked at over there, partially because there's a large tree near it and we haven't wanted to risk harming the tree. But I think that is one area that we haven't really looked at that could use a little bit more work. We could do a little bit more with feature 1, but I'm not sure how much it would really help us. But we definitely would talk to y'all. We plan to go back out there again. I hope that we get another chance to work together on the site. And we definitely couldn't have done any of it without HAS. So thank you to all of you. And I think that does it for me. What questions do you all have?
Okay, well, Amy, thank you very much for that presentation. I always like to have presentations about sites that HAS has worked on, right? It sort of brings it home to us as to what we're actually doing, and it's great. I much appreciate it. Has anybody got any questions? Let's open it out to
I do.
the floor. Gary.
Hey, Amy, the kaolin clay,
Mm-hmm.
where are the deposits? I mean, it's not like regular gray clay, or tell me about that.
Yeah, so I debated including a map of different a soils map in here and getting more into it, but there is a Miocene age deposit that comes down through Montgomery County that must have been what they were using. We have found a little bit of kaolin clay out there, just kind of walking the creeks and looking. There have been many samples taken of it to try to go back and determine if that was the clay that they were using. But it's a smaller band of it that comes down through Montgomery County. The bigger band of it goes up near Rusk County.
Is it white?
Yes, I should have just included the picture in this.
Kaolin. Yeah, white. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a very light gray or white.
Like kaolin chert. Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
All right. Thank you.
You had a slide of a splatterware teacup. I think you said it was green, and that's it. Had it.
Okay.
I assume that was found at the site, but obviously it's not manufactured at the site.
Exactly.
Or is it? Okay, that would have been brought in by somebody else.
Yeah, these are English
personal wear.
imports. Mhm. So they probably brought it with them. I mean,
Yeah, it's just
there was
we
no
found-
railroad here. I think it was likely very difficult to get. If you didn't bring it with you, I think it was probably very difficult to get things,
It's
which
just
is
we-
why we think they were making that stoneware tableware.
It's just that we found examples very, very similar to that at other sites that we've worked at as well. So,
Mhm.
interesting.
Amy, did we
Okay.
find any post holes? I can't remember when we were finding the foundations.
No post holes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Amy, a lot of potters will put their mark on the bottom of it or somewhere. What did the Kirbee family put? I know you were able to recognize it because of the shape and the glaze and things like that, but did they put a mark on it that indicated it was Kirbee pottery?
So they did not technically here. Let me go back to the beginning. Hold on. So the only like actual marks that usually were put on these things were numbers that would indicate the size that it contained.
Oh, wow.
But the ridges that are on that brown butter churn?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
That is something that has been stated was characteristic of Kirbee, because I guess most potters tend to smooth those out, and he would leave them for some reason.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can see a lot of potters leave it on there because they find that aesthetically appealing.
Mhm.
So, yes, thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay.
So Amy, you mentioned prehistoric artifacts found at the site. Could you summarize what has been uncovered there?
Yeah, so mostly flakes, chert flakes is what I've seen. And we have maybe a handful, like 10 or less pieces of just plain sandy paste ceramics.
Okay.
One more question. Since they put numbers on them, is there a estimation of about how many pieces of pottery the Kirbees ever made?
Oh no, the numbers would be how much the vessel could contain.
Oh, gotcha.
Like how
Okay.
many gallons or
Yes.
something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's not on every one either.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
so where were they mainly selling their wares to? I mean, how far did their reach go? Do you know?
Yeah, that is one of our questions that we have, but I mean, we think probably one of the reasons they took the risk coming to this area that was less well known is because the market wasn't flooded,
Right.
but they primarily were probably selling to the plantations. This was a huge area of enslavement, and plantations required jars for storage and for bringing water to the fields and things like that. So that was probably their primary client.
Maybe East Texas and West Louisiana would be their primary
Maybe,
areas.
maybe not even that far. It's
Okay.
hard to say.
Okay. All right. Okay, cool. And of course, any other questions?
One more. You may have said this, Amy. When they left the Montgomery County area, where did they go, and did they continue their business?
We don't know where they went. That is something that Meredith has really been looking into. And in fact, she has recently found one of the Kirbee descendants that she's supposed to be meeting with. But
Ah.
based on census records, it looks like, well, James Kirbee himself, he was getting older by the time he came to Texas in the first place. And he probably retired. And my guess is that his three sons just didn't continue with it because we see in census and deed records that they go on to own land in Montgomery County and their occupations are listed as farmer. So
Mm.
it may be that they just found that more profitable and easier and they just stopped making pottery.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Very interesting.
Okay. Okay. Any further questions? Well, Amy, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. As I said before, it's very nice to have a talk where we've actually been involved in the process. Please keep us apprised of the situation going forward
Absolutely.
with Kirbee Kiln, and please give my best to Meredith and David, particularly on David's recovery, and hopefully we'll talk to them again soon. And you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay.
Thanks, Amy.
Mhm.
Appreciate
And
it.
I'd like to wish everyone a very good evening.
See you down in McAllen, Amy.
Oh,
Or will we?
I don't know.
Bye-bye, and thank you.
I don't know about me either.
Bye now.
All right,
Bye-bye.
everybody
Bye.
take care. We'll see you. Let me stop this, Bob. Hold on.